So far, we've seen how to use two features of functions, arguments and return values. Now we'll learn about how scope works in functions. So we've seen a basic example of creating a function that takes arguments, performs some actions, and returns a value. Now there's another property of functions that's very important in JavaScript to understand, and that's called scope. Let's take a look at a very simple example. Let's say I have a variable named color, and I'll set its value to the string black. And let's say I have a function, show color, and right now we'll say it takes no arguments, and our body of our function is going to be this. We're going to say var color equals green. So what I'm going to do from inside our function is call console.log and use the variable color. So on line 26, we created a variable called color. Then we defined a function called showColor, inside of which we also defined another variable called color and have given it another value. So the question is, when we call showColor, what are we going to get? Place your bets now. Are we going to get black? Are we going to get green? Are we going to get an error? What's going to happen? Well, let's take a look. We're back on our page here, and if I refresh, we see we get green. Now, why does it do this? Well, on line 26, we created a variable, and we've created it at the global scope, which means that we've created it outside of any function. Now, what we've done on line 29 is created another variable called color. However, the difference is we've created it in what we call a new scope. And you can think of scope as sort of a namespace for our variables. Even though we already had a variable named color, we've created a whole new layer or a whole new namespace that we can define new variables in. And if we define new variables from inside a function, they will not collide with anything from a higher scope, including our global scope where our current color variable lives. So on line 29, it does not interact at all with the color that we defined on line 26. Instead, it creates a brand new variable that from within showColor, now the color variable will refer to that color green and not the color black. And to show that assigning the variable color equals green on line 29 does not interact with the color from outside of our function, after we call showColor, let's do console.log global color. We'll pass it color. Now I'm going to change this console.log here, and we'll add in another prefix here, and we'll say our show color and pass it the color from inside of showColor. So now what we're doing is we are calling showColor, which will execute the line 29 var color equals green, and then we'll inspect color from inside of our function. And we'll see that it will be green, which we saw last time, but let's see what happens after we call showColor, and on line 37, again, try to console.log the variable called color. If we refresh, we can see our showColor color is green, and our global color is still black. Now, does that mean from within a function we can't reach variables that are at a higher scope? Well, let's do another example. Let's say var number equals 1. And let's say from within showColor here, we log our number. And let's do the same thing after we call our showColor. So we've defined a variable number at our global scope, and when we call showColor, we're reaching that number in our console.log and logging its value. Then afterwards, we're also logging number once again on line 40. So what happens? We see that the number is 1 from inside of showColor, and number is also 1 inside of global, which means we're able to access higher level variables from within our function. However, what would happen if we wanted to reach the global color from within our function, where we've already defined a local color variable? Well, that's actually pretty difficult to do, because now that we've defined a local color and assigned it green, it's hard to reach that global color which was holding the value black. Now in our case, since it is global, there is a technique we can use, but let's not look at that right now. Essentially, what we've done is we've shadowed the variable. By giving a local variable the same name as a variable in a higher scope, we've made it inaccessible to us. Now, really, this is avoided by not giving variables at different scopes the same name. You can see we have no problem with number reaching up to the global scope, but since color is defined at a closer scope than the global scope, which we might want, we're unable to reach it, and this is called shadowing. Now, can we modify variables at a higher scope? Well, let's say we want to say number now equals 2. Now, what would happen? If we refresh, we can see that numbers not only changed to 2 from inside of show color, but it's also changed at the global scope. That's because on line 32, number refers to the exact variable that's defined on line 27. So just like we can assign a value to a variable from the global scope, we can also do it from inside the local scope. Now, why might this be a problem? Now you'll remember when I talked about defining variables in the previous videos that I said the var keyword is very important. And here's why it's really important. When we take a look here at our output, we see that the show color is green, but the global color remains black. And we talked about how they created a variable at a different scope. But what happens if we forgot to put the var keyword in front of color here? Well, that changes things. We're no longer defining a new variable called color at the local level. Instead, what we're doing is we're referring to the color variable at the global scope and assigning to it and changing it. So if we refresh, we'll now see it's actually changed the global color. And that can be very, very dangerous and very confusing to debug. So if you forget var when you meant to create a new variable, you might be actually changing the value of a variable at a higher level scope. Once again, this is something that you can avoid by not shadowing your variables or giving variables the same name at different level scopes. That way you don't have to worry about which one is which, but let's put var back in here. Now there's another curious property here. What if we were to do this? If we change and console.log our shape here, and let's also console it from the global scope. What would happen? Well, you might think since shape is not defined at the global scope, it will define a new variable called shape at show color. But we'll see what happens is actually a little bit different. So if we refresh, we can see the shape from inside show color is square, but also global has a variable called shape, which is also square. Now this may appear to work in our code if we miss this error. However, it might become very confusing because every time we call show color, it will refer to the exact same shape instance. Because what happened here is we assigned to a variable that we have not declared with a var keyword. And what JavaScript does in this case is it creates a global variable called shape and assigns it square because it didn't know what level to define that variable, so it went to global. Now this is a behavior that some consider to be a bug in JavaScript, but ultimately it's just something that can be harmful, and there's actually some settings that we can change that will avoid this behavior in the future. However, in JavaScript, if we forget the var keyword, it creates this global variable. And while show color may seem to still work the way we want, we're now creating a new global variable, and the implications of that may not be obvious and may result in some unusual bugs. So that's why the var keyword is so vitally important. If we were to put a var in front of that line here, this changes the meaning of our code entirely. Now instead of creating a global shape with square, we've only created a local one, which means on line 45, where we log the shape from the global scope, we now get the correct output, which is a reference error because we have not defined shape at the global scope. And by trying to access it, that causes an error in JavaScript. And that shows you that a function creates a brand new scope where whenever we use the var keyword, we're creating a variable only accessible from within this function call, which means that we can create all the variables we want inside of show color without worrying about bleeding them out to the global scope where they might be interacting with other things that are using that name or just producing unwanted behavior. So we'll see how function scope can be useful in an upcoming video where we talk about how functions can be used also as a tool to define scopes. In the next video, we'll see why scope is so important when we learn about anonymous functions.